Bryce teaches history, Mother. He's used to living in the past. Vivian can absolutely do better.
Eleanor really only left a little Harlem apartment and a pension, didn't she? At least Vivian doesn't have to worry about finances, the way her poor mother-in-law always did. Vivian deserves a world that matches her status, not slumming it with a low-class family like that. At least Vivian no longer has to carry that burden. Thank God Eleanor is finally gone. Finally gone.
Bryce stood there, vest soaked, shoes drenched, eyes steady. Not angry, not pleading, just looking. This was his mother's funeral. He said nothing. He turned, walked away. But his mother had been preparing for this moment, 3 years, in silence. What she left behind wasn't just money, it was a reckoning. Bryce Brooks was 34 years old, a high school history teacher in the South Bronx, and he believed, quietly, genuinely believed, that a good man who showed up every single day didn't need to announce himself. That quiet dignity was its own kind of power, that love, real love, didn't keep score. He had held on to that belief through 7 years of marriage. Then his mother died, and the people he had called family stood in the reception room of Riverside Memorial Chapel on East 76th Street in Manhattan, drinking $250 wine and laughing, while her casket sat not 60 feet away. That was the night everything Bryce thought he understood began to unravel. Not loudly, not all at once, the way a photograph fades, slowly and then suddenly, until you can no longer make out the faces. But here is what they didn't know. His mother had been quietly preparing for exactly this moment, for years. And what she left behind wasn't simply money, it was a reckoning. November rain in Manhattan has a particular quality, not quite cold enough to feel righteous, not quite mild enough to forgive. It falls in gray sheets that soak through everything. It had soaked through Bryce's $79 outlet store suit before he even reached the chapel steps. He stood in the corridor outside the main room, one hand braced against the wall, listening to the sound of his wife's family on the other side of the door. Patricia Whitman's voice carried the way it always did, effortlessly, the voice of a woman who had never once questioned whether she was welcome in a room.
Eleanor really only left a little Harlem apartment and a pension, didn't she?
A warm, unhurried laugh. At least Vivian doesn't have to worry about finances the way her mother-in-law always did. Then Jade, my wife's younger sister, 29, the kind of pretty that had curdled early into something sharp and unkind. Bryce teaches history, Mother. He's used to living in the past. She lowered her voice just enough to make sure it still carried. Vivian can absolutely do better. The laughter that followed was light, social, the kind of laughter people deploy when they want cruelty to sound like humor. Psychologists call this social derogation, the act of diminishing someone's value in front of a group to reinforce a shared hierarchy. It is rarely accidental. It is a strategy. And it works most effectively when the target is present to hear it, because the goal is not simply to wound, it is to remind everyone in the room, including the target, exactly where the power sits. Bryce had been hearing this music for 7 years. He knew every note. He put his hand on the door. He wanted to be near his mother, that was all. Patricia stepped into the doorway before he could push through. She was wearing cream-colored wool and pearl earrings the size of quarters, and she regarded him the way people regard something they've already decided doesn't require a response. "This is family time, Bryce." Her voice was almost gentle, almost. Eleanor wasn't really of our world. You understand. Someone behind her laughed, a small, agreeable sound, like applause for a point well made. Bryce stood in his wetsuit and said nothing. He had learned, over 7 years of marriage to my wife, Vivian Whitman Brooks, that some silences carry more dignity than any answer he could have given. He turned and walked back down the corridor. That was when he heard the footsteps. "Mr. Brooks." The man was perhaps 50, wearing a dark suit that fit the way well-made things fit, without effort. He carried himself with the measured patience of someone who had delivered difficult news many times and had learned how to hold it steady without dropping it. "My name is Chase Thornton. I'm an attorney." He reached into his jacket and produced a small brown envelope, old, the edges soft with handling. "Your mother asked me to give you this today. Specifically today. She said, and I want to be precise, give it to my son if they do what I know they'll do."
He held the envelope out. His eyes didn't waver.
"She prepared this 3 years ago, Mr. Brooks. She was very thorough."
Bryce took it. The paper was warm from the attorney's jacket. His mother's handwriting was on the front, just his name. Bryce. Written in the careful, deliberate letters of a woman who had taught herself to write precisely because no one had thought to teach her properly. The rain continued outside. Through the chapel wall, Patricia Whitman's laughter rose above the general conversation. Bryce held the envelope in both hands and did not open it. His mother had always told him, "Don't let anyone tell you who you are, baby. Make them watch."
Standing in that corridor, soaking wet, holding a letter sealed 3 years before she died, Bryce finally understood the full weight of what she meant. The story she had been quietly writing, the one he hadn't known he was living inside, had just turned to its first page. Stay right there, because what was inside that envelope changes everything, and the Whitman family is about to walk into a room they were absolutely not prepared for. The reading of the will took place the following morning in a third-floor conference room at Riverside Memorial Chapel. Long mahogany table, 12 chairs. The kind of room built for serious things, where the furniture itself seems to absorb sound and weight. On one side sat the Whitmans, Patricia in her cream wool, Richard, her husband, 64, wearing the settled expression of a man accustomed to controlling outcomes. Jade with her sharp jaw and sharper eyes, and my wife, Vivian, seated at the far end, hands folded, not quite looking at anyone. On the other side, Bryce. Just Bryce. Chase Thornton opened his leather portfolio without ceremony and began. "I, Eleanor May Brooks, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament." He paused exactly long enough. "I leave the entirety of my estate to my son, Bryce Aaron Brooks." Patricia set down her coffee cup. "Well, naturally. That's the apartment in Harlem and her pension. We expected as much." Chase Thornton did not look up. Total value of the estate at the time of declaration? Approximately $68 million. The room didn't gasp. It went the other kind of quiet. The kind where people stop breathing before they remember that they need to. What the Whitman family experienced in that moment is what psychologists call a schema collapse. The sudden failure of a mental framework maintained with total confidence. Patricia had built a clear, comfortable story. Eleanor Brooks was a working-class woman from Harlem with a small apartment and a modest pension. That story had organized everything. The condescension at family dinners, the laughter in the corridor, the casual dismissal at the funeral. When $68 million landed on that table, it didn't simply surprise her. It invalidated the entire architecture of her certainty. And the first instinct, always, is to defend the old story rather than accept the new truth. Jade's composure cracked first. She'd always had the least of it. "That can't be right." Her voice was too loud for the room. "My parents were told she only had a small inheritance from some aunt. Someone has to have miscalculated." She stopped. The color in her face shifted. because she had just told the room, in front of an attorney and a full table of witnesses, that her family had been actively investigating Eleanor Brooks's finances. Not out of idle curiosity, with enough specificity to report back what they believed they'd found. Chase Thornton continued without adjusting his tone. Beginning in 1991, Eleanor Brooks began purchasing multifamily residential properties in the Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhoods of New York City, at a time when market values in those areas were substantially depressed. She acquired 7 such properties over the following decade, holding them through multiple market cycles. She also maintained a consistent long-term equity portfolio, initiated in the late 1990s, emphasizing technology and infrastructure. He turned a page. She never refinanced, she never sold, she paid her taxes and her mortgages, and she told no one. Eleanor Brooks practiced what behavioral economists call stealth accumulation, the deliberate choice to build wealth without social visibility. For Black American families who came of age in the mid-20th century, financial discretion was often a survival strategy. Displaying wealth could invite scrutiny, resentment, or interference from institutions historically working against their financial progress. Eleanor's silence was not modesty. It was precision. The linoleum she patched 3 times, the cardigan she wore for 11 winters. These were not signs of poverty. They were signs of a woman who understood that the surest way to protect what she was building was to make certain no one knew she was building it. Richard Whitman leaned forward, recalibrating with the deliberate slowness of a man who did not want anyone to see him doing it. When was this will last amended? 4 years ago, Chase Thornton said. When Mrs. Brooks added the specific bequests, he opened the next section. To Patricia Whitman, $1. Patricia blinked. To Richard Whitman, $1. Chase Thornton did not pause. Alongside this bequest, Mr. Whitman will receive a certified copy of the correspondence and internal documentation from the 2004 Harlem Housing Equity Coalition meeting, including your written objections and your signature on the petition that successfully blocked 300 units of affordable housing in the 116th Street corridor. If this bequest is contested in any manner, that documentation will be forwarded in full to the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as to media organizations covering housing equity issues in New York City. Richard did not move. He had the face of a man watching a door lock from the outside. To Jade Whitman, $1. Chase Thornton's voice remained level. Mrs. Brooks also wishes Jade to know that she was fully aware of the inquiry Jade made into the assessed value and ownership history of Eleanor Brooks's properties. Mrs. Brooks found this neither surprising nor troubling. She simply believed Jade should know that she knew. Jade placed both hands flat on the table. Her jaw was working, but nothing was coming out. Eleanor Brooks had understood something most people only learn too late. The most effective response to contempt is not confrontation. It is preparation. She had not argued at holiday dinners. She had not confronted Jade about her comments. She had not asked Vivian to choose sides. She had simply watched, documented, and built, with the quiet precision of a woman who knew that the truth, properly preserved and delivered at the right moment, will always outlast the arrogance that tried to bury it. Psychologists describe this as delayed moral clarity, not vengeance, but the careful architecture of accountability. Eleanor had designed its delivery from a place none of them could reach her. Chase Thornton turned to the final section. There are 2 remaining bequests. The first pertains to Mrs. Brooks's daughter-in-law. He looked at Vivian directly for the first time. Bryce looked at my wife. She was very still. Her hands, which had been folded, were now pressed together, fingers interlaced, the way hands press when a person is trying to hold something inside. Bryce had seen that posture many times across 7 years of marriage. He had always read it as shyness, sensitivity. He was beginning to understand it as something else entirely. Mrs. Brooks had something specific to say to you, Vivian, Chase Thornton said evenly, and she intended to say it in this room. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Bryce had ever sat inside. Eleanor Brooks knew the truth for 3 years and chose to say nothing until this moment. Do you think staying silent was the right call, or should she have warned Bryce sooner? Drop a yes or no below. And if you've ever had to stay quiet to protect someone you love, we'd love to hear your story in the comments. Don't go anywhere, because what Eleanor left specifically for Vivian is the moment this story stops being about money and becomes something none of them will ever forget. Chase Thornton's voice did not change. That was the particular authority of the man. Every sentence delivered in the same measured register, whether it carried a dollar figure or a detonation. He understood that facts, stated plainly, do their own work. To my daughter-in-law, Vivian Brooks, he read, I leave $1. A beat. I also leave the following, a record of what you said and what you allowed to be said in the years my son trusted you with his heart. My wife Vivian's head came up for the first time. During their marriage, Vivian Brooks used a secondary cell phone on a shared family wireless plan with Eleanor Brooks. Messages sent and received on that device were automatically synchronized to a shared iCloud account. Mrs. Brooks discovered this 3 years ago. She preserved the messages and had them documented by a digital forensics firm in Lower Manhattan. She did not tell Bryce at that time. Chase Thornton paused. She wanted him to hear it first, in a room where the truth had already been fully established, where there was no question of misunderstanding, no room for doubt, where the record could stand entirely on its own. What Eleanor Brooks chose to do with that information reveals one of the most psychologically sophisticated decisions in this entire story. When she discovered those messages, she faced a clear choice: tell Bryce immediately or wait. Telling him immediately might have spared him years of quiet suffering. But Eleanor understood something about her son that Bryce may not have fully understood about himself. That a wound delivered without preparation rarely heals cleanly. Without context, without evidence, without time to process, people frequently don't leave painful relationships. They rationalize, they minimize, they turn the pain inward and blame themselves. Eleanor wanted more for her son. She wanted him to receive the truth in a form he could not argue himself out of, in a room with witnesses, with documentation, with no space left for self-doubt. That is not revenge. That is love with a long view. Mrs. Brooks wanted Bryce to hear her reasoning in her own words, Chase Thornton continued. He turned a page and read aloud. I didn't tell Bryce because I watched what knowing too early does to a man. It poisons the good years before they've had a chance to be good. I wanted him to have whatever real love was there to have, for as long as it lasted. But I also wasn't going to leave him with nothing but the wound and no explanation. He deserves to know the shape of what hurt him. That's not revenge. That's dignity. Bryce sat very still. His mother had written those words knowing she would not be alive when he heard them. She had sat at her kitchen table on 123rd Street, the same table where she'd mended what needed mending and invested quietly for 20 years without a word to anyone. And she had written a letter to her son for a day she would never see. There are moments when a person feels the full weight of someone's love. Not the comfortable version, not the version that costs nothing, but the real version. The version that required holding her own pain quietly for years so his could be delivered with precision and grace. This was one of those moments. The digital record includes, among other items, a message sent by Vivian Brooks in November, 3 years ago, Chase Thornton said. The message reads, precisely as recorded, I love him, I do. But I don't know how to explain to my family that this is permanent. They keep asking when I'm going to move on, and I keep not answering. I just keep not answering. Vivian's breath caught audibly. There is also a message from the following January, sent in response to a question from Jade Whitman. The question was, when are you going to stop playing house and come back to your own world? A pause. Vivian's response was, I know, I just need more time. 4 words. And in those 4 words, an entire architecture of ambivalence. Psychologists who study relational ambivalence identify a consistent pattern in partners who remain in a relationship on the surface while quietly maintaining an internal exit strategy. They don't leave decisively. They don't issue ultimatums. They simply wait. 1 foot inside the relationship, 1 foot pointed toward the door, telling themselves the discomfort is temporary, that they'll eventually know what they want, that staying is not the same as choosing. For the person on the receiving end, the one who has invested everything in good faith, the cruelty is not always intentional, but it is total. Because they are not being fully loved, they are being used as a placeholder while someone else decides. Bryce had not known he was a placeholder. He was beginning to know it now. There is one final notation in this section, Chase Thornton said, his voice steady. Mrs. Brooks wanted Bryce to understand the full origin of a portion of this estate, because she believed the truth belonged to him. He looked at Bryce directly. In 2003, Eleanor Brooks applied for a mortgage to purchase a commercial property in Harlem. She was denied. The stated reason was a documentation issue. The actual reason, established through subsequent legal proceedings, was unlawful discrimination by the lending institution. Mrs. Brooks retained an attorney. The case was settled in 2004 for a confidential sum. Eleanor accepted that confidentiality agreement on one condition, that the funds be placed in an irrevocable trust for her son's future benefit. She invested every dollar. She never touched it.
And she never told Bryce, because...
He read her words again. Because I did not want him carrying the weight of my wound through his own life. He had enough to carry. This was mine to carry, and I carried it, and now it is his to build with, not to mourn with, to build. Eleanor Brooks had absorbed a profound injustice and refused to let it define the story she passed forward. She took the settlement, the years of silence, and the accumulated weight of what had been done to her, and she transformed all of it into something her son could use to protect others. Psychologists call this post-traumatic growth, the documented capacity some people develop to emerge from suffering not merely restored, but genuinely transformed. Not despite the wound, because of what they chose to do with it. Eleanor Brooks is the clearest embodiment of that principle this story has to offer. Across the table, my wife reached out and placed her hand over Bryce's. For 7 years, that gesture had meant something to him. He moved his hand away. Not in anger, not in cruelty. In the quiet, queer way a person moves when they have finally understood something they have been looking away from for a very long time. It was the first choice Bryce Brooks had made entirely for himself. And in the stillness of that mahogany room, with the Whitman family watching and saying nothing, that small movement carried the full weight of everything that had brought them to this table. Stay with me, because that night, alone in his mother's kitchen, Bryce opens one more audio file. And what he hears is the moment this story stops being about what was done to him and becomes something he will carry for the rest of his life. Bryce drove home to Harlem alone. Not to the house in Brooklyn Heights, where he and my wife had lived for 4 years. The one with the bay window she'd loved and the radiator that knocked every November like it was trying to warn them about something. He drove to his mother's apartment on 123rd Street, which was his now, though that word, his, still sat strange and heavy in his mouth. The apartment smelled like her, cardamom and old paper and the dry warmth of a radiator that had been running since before Bryce was born. He sat at her kitchen table, opened the laptop Chase Thornton had couriered that morning, and logged into the secure file archive. 11 files. He started with the oldest. Thanksgiving, 2019. The Whitman brownstone on Pierpont Street in Brooklyn Heights. 3 stories, high ceilings, the kind of house that announces a family's opinion of itself before you've knocked. Bryce had sat at that table 4 times. He had smiled at jokes he didn't find funny, complimented the centerpiece, and said thank you when Patricia mentioned how much Vivian had grown since she stopped trying to be a teacher herself. The recording was made on a small device, decent sound quality, a kitchen during cleanup, most guests already in the living room. Patricia's voice came through clearly. "Vivian, honey, I'm going to say this once." The clink of dishes being stacked. "You know we love you, and we have been patient, but a history teacher in the Bronx? Sweetheart, that ceiling is right there." Right above his head. There is no elevator. Vivian quietly. "Mom, you deserve someone who can give you a life, not a lesson plan. Someone from our world. The same culture, the same values, the same—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "I know," Vivian said, flat, practiced. The voice of someone who had offered those 2 words many times before. "But he's good, Mom. He's genuinely good." "Honey." A pause. A dish set down. Good is not the same as right. What Patricia Whitman was doing in that kitchen has a clinical name. Enmeshment coercion. Using family loyalty and belonging as leverage to redirect an adult child's autonomous choices. It is rarely delivered as a command. It comes wrapped in concern, in love. In the gentle, persistent suggestion that the person you have chosen represents a lapse in judgment rather than a genuine decision. The most insidious version doesn't say, "choose us or him." It simply repeats, in different tones across years, that your chosen partner is fundamentally not enough, and that your love for him reflects poorly on your own discernment. It works slowly, and it works most effectively on people who already carry a deep, unspoken uncertainty about whether they have the right to disappoint the family that raised them. Vivian Whitman had been hearing that music her entire adult life. The question was whether she had ever found the courage to change the channel. Bryce pressed play on the second file. A phone call. Vivian and Jade. February 2 years ago. Traffic behind Jade's voice. Kitchen sounds behind Vivian's. A Tuesday afternoon. An ordinary call between sisters. Except that it wasn't.
"I just don't understand why you're still doing this."
It's not that simple.
"It is, though. You don't have kids yet, and the longer you wait,
Jade,
the harder the conversation gets. You know what I'm saying."
Vivian was quiet for a long moment, and then, in a voice that was low and careful and unmistakably honest, she said the thing she had never said out loud before.
I love him. I honestly do. But I don't want to have to explain to our children why their father looks different from the rest of the family. I don't want them growing up having to answer for something that isn't their fault.
A pause.
And I know how that sounds.
I know, but I can't stop feeling it. There is a specific and devastating kind of pain that comes not from cruelty, but from honesty. Cruelty can be named and rejected, but honest ambivalence, the kind that is ashamed of itself and still entirely real, enters a person differently. There is nothing to argue with. The feeling existed, she had carried it, and in choosing to carry it in silence rather than confront it directly, she had made a choice. To protect herself from discomfort rather than protect Bryce from its consequences. Psychologists who study internalized bias describe how people can hold prejudiced beliefs that their conscious mind rejects, yet experience those beliefs as something happening to them, as an external force rather than an internal one. I can't stop feeling it, is the language of that experience. It is also, whether consciously or not, a form of self-absolution. If the feeling simply arrives unbidden, responsibility for it becomes harder to locate. Bryce bore none of the responsibility, and he had absorbed all of the cost. He did not cry at first. He sat in the dark and breathed the way his mother had taught him when he was 9 years old. Slow in through the nose, count to 4, out through the mouth. She had shown him after his father left, when he'd asked her how she managed not to break. "I get up before it breaks me," she had told him. Every time. At some point, he did cry. He would say that plainly, without apology. He cried in his mother's kitchen, in the chair she had sat in with her morning coffee for 30 years. And he grieved the marriage he had believed he was living inside, the one where love was mutual, where he was chosen, where showing up every day was enough. Then he wiped his face, opened the laptop, and filed the divorce papers at 11:47 p.m. When my wife came home the following afternoon, red-eyed, her voice already softened into an apology, Bryce was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he had let go cold. He looked at her for a long moment. She was still the woman he had loved. That was not in question. But he had come to understand something his mother had tried to give him years before he was ready to receive it. Loving someone does not obligate you to keep offering them the chance to love you poorly. And accepting that arrangement, calling it patience, calling it commitment, is not strength. It is the slow erosion of knowing your own worth. "Chase Thornton will be in touch," he said. "He has the paperwork." Vivian said his name, just once, like a door closing on a sound a person isn't quite ready to stop hearing. Bryce stood, rinsed his cup, set it carefully on the drying rack, the small, ordinary gesture of a man stepping cleanly out of one chapter and into the next. Then he went to work. Don't go anywhere, because 6 months later, Bryce has built something extraordinary, and someone is about to walk through the door with something that gives this entire story its final, most powerful meaning. 6 months later, Bryce was still driving the 2009 Camry. That was a deliberate choice, not a performance, not the kind of pointed humility that is really just pride wearing different clothes. A genuine choice, made the morning Chase Thornton confirmed the estate transfer, when Bryce sat at his mother's kitchen table with the number $68 million on a document in front of him, and asked himself, quietly, clearly, what kind of man he intended to be now that he had the resources to be almost anything. His mother had already answered that question. He was only now catching up to her. The Eleanor Brooks Community Learning Center opened on a Tuesday morning in April, on a stretch of Amsterdam Avenue in Harlem where Eleanor had walked to the bus stop every day for 30 years. The building was a former bank, 2 stories, high ceilings, tall windows that drew early spring light in long, clean rectangles across the hardwood floor. Free tutoring Monday through Saturday. Academic coaching for students from the Bronx and Harlem, 6th grade through 12th, with a particular focus on the students no one else was particularly focused on. The ones who were capable but hadn't been told so. The ones who needed someone to sit across from them and say, "You are not behind. You are not less. You are exactly on time." Bryce still taught every morning, still drove the Camry to the South Bronx and stood in front of 28 11th graders and taught them the history that people with power had always tried to tell them didn't belong to them. He was not a different man because he had money. He was the same man, with better tools and more room to use them. This distinction carries more weight than it might first appear. Research on individuals who experience sudden and significant wealth or any major life change, including divorce or inheritance, consistently shows that those who already possessed a coherent, internally rooted sense of identity before the change are far more likely to use it constructively. Those whose identity was fragile or defined primarily by external validation tend to find that new resources simply amplify existing instability. Bryce had spent 7 years in a marriage where his value had been quietly and sometimes openly questioned. He had navigated a family that measured his worth by the ceiling they assumed he had. And he had emerged from all of it with his identity not merely intact, but clarified. Because there are only two outcomes when someone tells you who you are not, with conviction and consistency over a long period of time. Either you begin to believe them, or you become more certain than ever of who you actually are. Bryce had chosen the second, and now he was building from it. Chase Thornton called on a Thursday afternoon. The Whitmans withdrew their contest filing this morning. Richard's attorney sent the letter at 9:15. Bryce set down his pen. No explanation? None offered, none needed. He was right. Richard Whitman was a man who understood leverage clearly enough to recognize when he had none. The documentation Eleanor had preserved, decades of paper trail, ready to be delivered to the SEC and to newsrooms covering housing equity, had not required a single phone call to activate. Its existence alone had been enough. Some debts are settled in courtrooms. Others are settled in the quiet withdrawal of a letter on an ordinary Thursday morning. Both count. Bryce was in the center's main tutoring room on a Friday afternoon in May when the front door opened. He almost didn't recognize her at first. My wife had always carried herself with the particular elegance of a woman whose family had spent generations cultivating exactly that impression. Silk blouses, small jewelry, the effortless poise of someone who never had to try. What stood in the doorway now was different. She was thin in the way people become when they've stopped being comfortable inside their own presentation. Hair pulled back simply, gray knit sweater, flat shoes, no jewelry at all. For the first time in 7 years of knowing her, Vivian looked like herself. Not the person her family had always required her to be, but the person underneath that. She was holding an envelope. She sat down across from him at one of the small student tables and set it between them without a word. "I've been teaching in Queens," she said. Her voice was steady in a way that suggested it had recently been rebuilt. "6th grade reading, since January." He nodded once. "This is what I have." She touched the envelope. 5 months of my own work, $12,000. I want it to go to the center, to your mother's fund. She met his eyes briefly, then looked at the table. "I'm not trying to fix what happened. I know that's not how it works." A pause, careful and considered. "But she was kind to me, your mother. She was genuinely kind to me, and I allowed my family to treat that kindness like it didn't matter. And I never once stood up and said enough." Her voice dropped slightly. "I was a coward for 7 years. I don't know how to say that any other way." What Vivian was doing in that moment, arriving with earned money, offering it without expectation of forgiveness, naming her failure plainly, is what psychologists call reparative action. The attempt to repair a relational wrong not through words alone, but through concrete, personal cost. She had not sent a check from a family account. She had brought money she earned herself, in a classroom, teaching children, in a life that had nothing to do with the world her family had built for her. It was, in its quiet way, the first entirely autonomous choice she had ever made. Whether she would continue making them was not Bryce's concern. His chapter with her had closed, but he was capable of recognizing the beginning of someone else's. Bryce accepted the envelope. He placed it on the table between them. "It'll go to the scholarship fund," he said. "The kids it helps will be real, and they'll be better for it. That's what matters now." Vivian nodded once, small, careful. The nod of a woman who understood she was not owed more than that. She stood, picked up her bag, and walked toward the door. She stopped with her back still to him. "Thank you for being who you were," she said quietly, "even when I didn't know what that was worth." The door closed behind her. The center was quiet again. Bryce sat at the small table in the late afternoon light and breathed. "Stay with me one more minute." Because what Bryce does next, alone in that room with his mother's letter, is the moment this story becomes something that belongs to all of us. After my wife left, Bryce sat at the small tutoring table for a long while and let the quiet settle around him. The last student of the day had gone home an hour earlier, a 13-year-old named Marcus from the Bronx who had come in convinced he couldn't write and left with 2 paragraphs he was genuinely proud of. His classroom teacher had told him he wasn't a writer. Bryce had told him his teacher was looking at the wrong thing. When someone tells you who you are not, he had said, with enough conviction and for long enough, there are only 2 possible outcomes. Either you believe them, or you become more certain than ever of who you actually are. Marcus had chosen the second. He'd written his 2 paragraphs and read them back out loud with a voice that started uncertain and finished steady. Bryce thought about that now, in the quiet of a May afternoon, the light going long and amber through the tall windows. In his office off the main hall, there was a photograph on the desk. Eleanor Brooks, 1997. Standing in front of a 3-story brick building in Bedford-Stuyvesant she had just finished purchasing. She didn't look wealthy. She looked like a woman who had quietly done something enormous and was allowing herself exactly one unguarded moment of satisfaction before getting back to work. She was wearing the beige cardigan. Of course she was. In the bottom drawer of his desk, Bryce kept a single audio file. One Chase Thornton had flagged separately from the main archive, labeled with a date 3 months before Eleanor's death. He had set it aside deliberately. He had been saving it for a moment when the hard parts were behind him and the air had cleared enough to truly hear her. He sat down, put in his earbuds, and listened. His mother's voice. Not reading from a document, not speaking for a room, just speaking. The sound of her kitchen behind her, the radiator, the quiet of a woman alone with her thoughts and a recording device, and something she needed to say while she still could. Bryce, if you're hearing this, then the rest of it has already happened. You've heard the hard parts, and you're still standing. I know you're still standing because that's who you are. That's who I raised you to be. I want you to know something I never said out loud while I was there to say it. I was proud of you every single day. Not for what you earned, not for what any of this money might mean now. I was proud of you because you chose to be kind when kindness cost you something. You chose to show up when leaving would have been simpler. You chose dignity in rooms that were designed to take it from you. And that cost you. I watched it cost you. I am sorry I couldn't protect you from all of it. But I need you to understand something. The things that cost you the most are also the things that built you. And the man you became, that man is worth building a world around. Build it big enough for other people to stand in. I love you. I am proud of you. I have always been proud of you. There is a concept in developmental psychology called secure attachment. The internal foundation formed through early relationships that tells a person at the most fundamental level, I am loved. I am worthy. I am not alone. Research consistently shows that individuals with secure attachment are more resilient under sustained stress, more capable of forming healthy relationships after painful ones, and more likely to move toward rebuilding rather than retreating after betrayal. Bryce Brooks had built that foundation at a kitchen table on 123rd Street with a woman who wore the same cardigan for 11 winters and patched the linoleum 3 times. And invested quietly for 2 decades without a word to anyone. Eleanor had given her son many things. The most enduring of all of them was not $68 million. It was the unshakable, bone-deep knowledge that he was worth loving well, and that if the love he was being offered didn't meet that standard, he was permitted to walk away from it. That knowledge, more than any revelation in a mahogany conference room, more than any dollar amount, was what would allow him to walk forward. Bryce put the recorder back in the drawer. He turned off the office light. He walked out into the main room of the Eleanor Brooks Community Learning Center. The high ceilings, the tall windows, the small tables where students from Harlem and the Bronx arrived doubting themselves and left a little less so. He stood in the center of the room in the last light of the day and let himself feel it. Not the grief, not the betrayal, not the long wait of 7 years spent in a marriage that had asked more of him than it had ever given back. Something cleaner than all of that. Purpose. Direction. The knowledge that his mother had looked at the world clearly, had been hurt by it honestly, and had chosen, with extraordinary intention, not to pass the hurt forward. She had passed something else forward instead, and he had caught it. This story teaches us that the most powerful inheritance a parent can leave is not money. It is the clarity to know your own worth. Eleanor Brooks spent 20 years quietly building something her son would need. She absorbed injustice and refused to let it define the story she passed on. She watched cruelty move through her son's home and chose patience over panic, because she understood that the truth, properly preserved and delivered at the right moment, will always outlast the arrogance that tried to bury it. For everyone who has ever been the quiet one in the room, the one who kept showing up, who didn't make a scene, who kept building while others were busy laughing, this story is for you. The ground you build on belongs to you, and someday the room will go silent, and the truth will stand on its own. Just like Eleanor always knew it would. This story was crafted from a human heart with gentle support from AI. Its only purpose is to remind you that miracles are not always dazzling. Sometimes they are simply a moment of justice served, or a smile returned to kindness that was tested. Production team story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Wynn. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Wynn. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.